Hi, I'm Ramona Luengen, and I'm a composer, conductor, and educator living in Burnaby, British Columbia. I'd like to thank Morna for giving me this opportunity to share some of my music as part of the Elektra Composer Series. Our history goes back a long time. I sang with the group when it was formed, and I've had numerous commissions from the group over the years. So I'm going to start with a few pieces that share a subject matter, and that is Mary as in the Mother of Christ, the Mother of God. And I'm often drawn to traditional sacred texts because I find they speak at a very universal level. Latin as opposed to English that carries with it a lot of baggage, sort of preconceptions and nuances that change. Latin allows us to sort of steep ourselves into a spirituality which is perhaps more intuitive and more elemental. So, and we know a lot of Latin texts like the Ave Verum and Mass parts, but I don't think the feminine side of that is shown too much, and that's why I was drawn to these particular texts. So the first piece I'm going to talk about is the Salve Regina, and that was written for Elektra's first ever concert. So co-founder Diane Loomer came up to me and said, would you write us a piece? And it was early in my career, and I said, well, if you give me $1, I can officially call it a commission. So that was the deal that we had. So that was the first piece I wrote for Elektra, and it was written for women's choir, obviously, and a soprano solo or a flute solo, and at that time it was played by the flute solo. The piece has been done a lot, more often with soprano solos. It's also done by relatively accomplished youth choirs. There's a few challenges in the piece in that there's a substantial low tessitura to the alto twos, so you need a little bit of heft in that section. I try to particularly write for the inner voices so that they also have something to work on, because often they are neglected, I find. Some of the key changes are a bit difficult to maneuver, but I think overall it's a piece that will lend itself well to mature choirs. There's the issue of meters, should I say, that constantly change, and I don't do that to aggravate any conductor, but I use that often to mitigate bad word stress. So you will find meters constantly changing to help choirs keep the flow of the music and not worry about bad accents in that. So that piece was recorded on Elektra's first recording called Elektra. The next piece I'd like to talk about is Ave Dulcissima Maria. Marilyn Kirkley, who was a conductor of the Ariosa Women's Choir in Edmonton, Alberta, came up and said, could you write us something that's similar to the Salve Regina? So this, of course, is women's choir, soprano solo. Again, a Marian text, very similar in terms of its sort of theme. Same dynamics, basically, also in need of a good alto 2 section to keep it well balanced. And there's a section towards the end of the piece where it divides into 7, and each group has a little pattern, and then we're asked, of course, the singers ad-lib this particular section, and it becomes an aleatoric section. And I wanted it to represent, it's on the word Alleluia, and it's to represent sort of the ecstatic joy of this particular word. And sometimes when we do things that are off the rhythm, it sort of creates this great sort of energy, this almost complex energy that we can't put our finger on. And the effect sounds much more complex than it is, which is always great for choirs to hear. And it would also be a good introduction to aleatoric singing for choirs. The next piece is Assumpta Est Maria, and this was commissioned by Elektra for their 20th anniversary. So they asked me to include a string orchestra and also a mezzo-soprano solo. So it's a larger work than the previous ones that I've been chatting about. It actually uses 2 texts. One is the text that is used for the Assumption of Mary, feast day, and the other one is a poem by Maria Rilke, who I have a great love for. So we have the choir starting off with the Latin text, almost sort of in an abstract form, and the soprano solo comes in then with this beautiful text by Rainer Maria Rilke, and he explains in beautiful human terms the sight of Mary entering heaven and seeing her son there. And he creates this vision of great fragility, almost heartbreaking in how it is, and also the joyous sort of exaltation of the angels. And there's this great humanity around it. So we see an event taking place in heaven, but in very human terms. So the spiritual is given human sort of human quality, and the human becomes spiritual. And I find this just a remarkable sort of sense of two different planes joining. So what I tried to do is I have the choir begin with the Latin, the soloist comes in, she sings in German on the Rilke, and they're almost giving us sort of two different perspectives of what this particular image is. And then they join together in the German text, and then at the end the choir will end in the Latin. So this requires a mature choir to understand sort of the planes of music and the planes of the imagery. It requires obviously a very good mezzo-soprano solo and a string orchestra. So not an easy piece, but if you have forces like that, it would certainly lend itself to sort of being a largish work on your program. The last piece I want to talk about is my Stabat Mater, which is a very large work, 80 minutes long. It includes choir, a mezzo-soprano solo, and an orchestra. And I can hear you all gasping now because we all know the price of hiring an orchestra. But perhaps you win the lottery, or you have a donor on board who's interested in something like this, or you're just tired of choosing 25 3-minute pieces for your program. This was done by Elektra in 1995 with the CBC Radio Orchestra. Mario Bernardi was conducting. And the Stabat Mater text is a well-known text. It's been used and set to music by composers throughout the eras, anywhere from Pergolesi right up to James Macmillan in our century. It lends itself very much because of the emotive quality of the text. There are 20 stanzas. They're relatively regular in rhyme scheme and in rhythm. So what I did to enlarge the musical palette and also the emotional palette is that I interpolated other poetry with it. So I added 3 poems by Anna Akhmatova in Russian, a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, a poem by the French-Canadian composer Rina Lasnier, the German poet Gertrude von Lefort, and the English poet Edith Sitwell. And all of them are 20th century poets, and all of them speak very, very eloquently about the tragedy of losing a child particularly, but also just suffering, especially during the world wars. So it was a great way to sort of augment this particular thing to make it from a universal thing to quite a personal statement. It's very demanding for the choir in terms of stamina, in terms of very difficult music, the languages, of course, and I think just the emotion that is required to make this piece work. I would love to hear it again. So it was moving for the choir, and I think at the end of the very long rehearsal process, which is what you need, it proved to be one of those pieces that seemed to get it under the skin the longer you worked at it. So that's the Stabat Mater. There's no recording of that, but if you are interested in doing that piece, do write to me. That would be wonderful. And if you're interested in any other pieces, please check my website at ramonaluengen.com. And I do have audio clips for most of my music, so help yourself to that. Thank you.